Notes on the universality of communism. If we had to carry out the exercise of trying to concentrate the significance of the reconstitution line, LR, in the most encompassing way possible, which less substantial elements left out, in a single sentence, we would say that the LR represents nothing but the recovery of the universality of communism. This, immediately, expresses nothing other than the assumption with all the consequences of the special position that, as a social class, the proletariat occupies in the historical process as a totality and, with it, the objective possibility of identifying its revolutionary struggle for its emancipation as such a social class with the emancipation of humanity as a whole with respect to class society and all its scourges. And this consequent assumption cannot less, and also immediately, than put us on a collision course with the labor movement of revisionism, which is only capable of representing the proletariat as a special class, not by concentrating the universality of the historical process, but, on the contrary, by locking itself and enclosing it in its particularity, that is, in its immediate traits given as a subjugated and exploited class. That and not another is the basis of all trade union corporatism and a consequent struggle against which, not by chance, he has had to receive his baptism and first forge the LR. But let's explore some of the fundamental elements of this universality as they have been forming in the historical course, and how their characteristics shape that other product of that process that is our class and its revolutionary aspiration. In the tradition of Western thought, whose most enlightened offspring is Marxism, universalism is, in the first instance, a category and a character carried by the subject. Valga, as a conspicuous representative example of such a tradition, the philosophy of Kant, where subjectivity transfers an order inscribed in itself to the outside world, which, in this way, is endowed with an apprehensibility and a universality of which it would otherwise lack. Thus, therefore, universality implies in itself a reference to a subject as a sphere of more or less autonomous activity, not absolutely determined, and even with an inner capacity for determination. Again, here, the contrast with revisionism is immediate, since it is nothing but the most genuine representative of the proletariat as an absolutely determined class in its subordination. It is not surprising, consequently, his natural drive to abhor any problem that affects the subject, subjectivity and consciousness, which, through his empiricist and economicist blinders, assimilates stereotypically with idealism. What would these inveterate short-sighted people, for example, say of Engels, who, in his introduction to the dialectic of nature, literally placed in the human spirit the supreme product of organic matter? But let's leave aside for a moment our grayish revisionists and focus on Engels' words, paying special attention to that designation of the human spirit as a product. Indeed, this last word immediately evokes a series of interesting traits and ideas. Product, first of all, obviously appeals to the attribute of being the result of something else and places us in the necessary company of a producer, whose ability to operate and model what it emits. That product requires the protection of a common substrate. In this case, since the human spirit is the product of a process of development of organic matter, subjectivity must and can only be, both in its empirical immediate meaning and from any other broader perspective, to be understood in turn as a material element itself. With this, simply, we are referring to one of the basic aspects of contradiction, that of unity and identity, but, secondly, and for the same reason, that requires immediately referring to its other respect, that of distinction and antagonism. And here, precisely, we see how that objective movement of matter, when it reaches a certain point of its development, highlights its other, its counterpart and negation, precisely that subjectivity that, in that contradictory object-subject unit, has constituted one of the fundamental prisms from which to try to consider and understand the development of the human being in the world. Finally and elementarily, the mere idea of a product requires the preeminence and priority of that producer, of some type of element or substrate that must necessarily precede what becomes of it, making it non-existent without it. We have, therefore, a temporary order of succession marked by the qualitative leap of that production. We have, therefore, history. If we align these elements, almost inadvertently entrenched, matter, contradiction and history, we will realize that we have come across, nothing less, then with the essential ingredients of dialectical materialism. And precisely, before this we find a new form, qualitatively superior, of materialism, precise and fundamentally by its understanding of the substantiveness of the subjective aspect of matter. This is precisely what the first thesis on Feuerbach refers to. It seems no coincidence that such is the subject matter on which is precisely the first, and not some subsequent one, of those humble notes that, in Engels' words, represent nothing less than the first document in which the genial germ of the new conception of the world is contained. The fundamental defect of all previous materialism is that it only conceives things, reality, sensoriality, in the form of an object or contemplation, but not as a human sensory activity, as a practical, not in a subjective way. Also does not conceive of human activity as an objective activity. Therefore, he does not understand the importance of revolutionary, practical critical action. It is precisely the understanding of the subjectivity of matter, that conceiving things, reality, in a subjective way, which allows the notion of revolution to be founded as the guiding axis of an entire conception of the world. And by the way, it does not seem accidental either that the genial germ of such a worldview nestles in what can essentially be considered as a whole as the master guideline of a critique that overcomes all old materialism. In any case, we have that dialectical materialism informs us of the character and origin of subjectivity as a material product. In turn, and on this basis, historical materialism will warn us of the line of its evolution, which is none other than that of its growing preeminence, that of the progressive protagonism and dominance of subjectivity as the development of matter successively reaches higher stages, highlighting this subjectivity increasingly as consciousness. Let's give the floor again to Engels, who, in his aforementioned introduction, points out, men, on the contrary, as they move further away from animals in the narrow sense of the word, to a greater extent make their history themselves, consciously, and the less the influence that unforeseen circumstances and uncontrolled forces exert on this story, and the more precisely the historical result corresponds to the purposes established in advance. Likewise, in the role of work in the transformation of the monkey into man, Barmans points out, the more men move away from animals, the more the character of an intentional and planned action acquires its influence on nature, the purpose of which is to achieve objectives projected in advance. Thus, following Engels, a prioristic purposes, final intentionality, consciousness, the latter, supreme product of matter, only appears, of course, as its coronation in its superior form, social matter, linked to the human race. But let's stop for a moment about this category, that of purpose, associated with a considerably advanced stage of development of subjectivity, to illustrate a little more the deep penetration and interweaving of it on matter. This intentionality, especially in its conscious form, has been historically hypostatic, sublimated, by speculative thinking, in the narrow sense of the term, and philosophy under the concept of teleology. However, more recently, and already referring to inferior forms of matter, strictly lacking in consciousness, they have necessarily had to begin to reconsider these traits of subjectivity, such as the purpose. Thus, for example, in the highest form of organic matter, the biological, modern science, even despite its anti-finalist origins, which date back to the scientific revolution and the struggle for the emancipation of scientific knowledge from theological tutelage, has had to coin, already in the second half of the 20th century, the concept of teleonomy. Leaving aside the relationship of this notion with the theory of evolution, let's compare its etymology with that of the category of teleology. Both words are neologisms formed from the Greek and both share teles, that is, end. But, in turn, both culminate in a different way, either by analogy, referring to study, treatise, science, knowing in short, or nomos, that is, rule, law. In this way, while teleology refers to an end arranged according to knowledge, to a conscious purpose, teleonomy alludes to the fact that that end is articulated by more of laws. And here it is possible to state what is the universal maxim as far as the law is concerned: its ignorance does not exempt from its compliance. Thus, what results is an inferior form of that purpose, already increased form of subjectivity in itself, absolutely unconscious and dominated by the objective factor, that is, by an impersonal mechanism that makes its way regardless of the domains or individuals on which it acts. The comparison is illustrative because it is a forceful example that shows how, from the point of view of modern developments of science, subjectivity, and, we insist, even in the developed way of purpose, is not exclusive of the stage of social development of matter, which is a reaffirmation of the global, universal relevance of dialectical materialism, while showing how that subjectivity is increasingly perfected towards and up to this stage. Precisely, and although the concept of teleology is problematic from the point of view of Marxism, this field, that of society, is that of deployment of that superior form of purpose governed by consciousness. Even more, if the founding notion of Marxism as an integral worldview of society is praxis, the purpose will play a key role in the basic core of this category, such as work. In fact, that final intentionality is what distinguishes it as a specifically human activity. We suppose work in a way in which it belongs exclusively to man. A spider performs operations that resemble those of the weaver, and the bee embarrasses more than one architect in the construction of its cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best bee is that he has built the cell in his brain before building it in wax. At the end of the work process, a result is obtained that already existed at the beginning of it in the imagination of the worker in an ideal way. It is not that it only makes a change of form in the natural element, but, at the same time, it makes its end in the natural element. The conscious will of the end is required for the entire duration of the work. In this way, to the dismay of several objectivists and economists, the conscious will of the end, subjectivity and consciousness, are intertwined in the deepest part of the Marxian conception of society, with far-reaching consequences for the whole of its doctrinal building. 6. The work is in Marx, as we say, the basic core of a broader conception, social production, where social relations themselves also play the very role of productive force, perhaps the most important of all. Precisely, capitalism is the first historical form of economy where the social element predominates over the natural one. 8. That is why only through and with the implantation of the capitalist mode of production is the subjective force that nestles in human work as it had never done before. Marx and Engels express it eloquently in the Communist Manifesto. It has been she who has first demonstrated what human activity can do. The bourgeoisie, with its class dominance, which has barely a century of existence, has created productive forces more abundant and more grandiose than all past generations combined. Which of the past centuries could he even suspect that such productive forces were dormant in the bosom of social work? This power will increasingly envelop all aspects of human existence and, in its culmination with imperialism, will end up closing on the entire globe. Giving an account of the prophetic sentence of the manifesto itself, the bourgeoisie is forging a world in its image and likeness. This closure, this turning the entire planet into a single articulated organism, allows us to emphasize a second notion, to be added to that of subjectivity, associated with universality, perhaps the most evident, that of uniqueness, that of totality. However, capitalism, when springing historically from the forms of natural economy, cannot avoid adhering to itself some of the determining modes that define those past forms, thus configuring its character as a lower stage of social matter. Precisely, from this comes a decisive feature, perhaps the most, that determines that explosion of social power that is capitalism, spontaneity. Marx and Engels, and German ideology, emphasize it. The division of labor already gives us the first example that, while men live in a spontaneously formed society, while there is, therefore, a separation between the particular interest and the common interest, while the activities do not appear divided voluntarily, but spontaneously, the acts of man are erected before him in an alien and hostile power that subjugates him instead of being he who dominates him. This is one of the main reasons, which rides on the back of that ruse of Hegelian reason, for which capitalism transposes this extraordinary emergence of subjectivity and human social forces and makes it appear inverted, objective, as an element of subjection and domination. Surely this historical process has not been expressed in a more illustrative way than in the first chapter of El Capital. Their Marx shows that growing emergence of the social form, of the progressive intertwining and interdependence of man's productive activities, using the commodity form as an axis and key prism, all of which culminates, not by chance, in the fetishism of that social relationship of men, which adopts the phantasmagorical form of a relationship between things. In this way, this dialectic of objectification of the human subjective power that is capitalism will generate a negative totality, a class that is condensation of all the conditions of existence and contradictions of the capitalist regime, the proletariat. In the fully developed proletariat, all humanity is abstracted, even of the appearance of humanity, and the conditions of existence of the proletariat. All the conditions of existence of today's society are condensed in its most inhumane form. Man has lost himself. Again, the philosophical substrate on which revisionism, empiricism, feeds, is unable to recognize this totality, this condensation of conditions of existence, and confuses its phenomenal reverberations with substantive elements. That empiricism is only the theoretical basis on which archetypal revisionist policy inevitably feeds, that is, the fronteism, the external political alliance of a proletariat reduced to its immediate union manifestation with other forms of resistance reverberation. The worker, that poor conception whose food is the superficial exaltation and exploitation of a certain social identity, paradoxically, represents only the denial of the determining role with which the historical development of social matter invests the proletariat. Consequently, the revolutionary movement of our class has only been able to forge itself in the fight against it. The knowledge of itself, on the part of the working class, is inseparably linked to the complete clarity not only of the theoretical concepts, but also of the ideas elaborated on the basis of the experience of political life about the relations between all the classes of today's society. It is worth repeating Lenin's forceful and unequivocal words: the proletariat's self-knowledge is linked to both the theoretical clarity and the totality of the political experience of society. As you know, what to do is a key work to understand the constitution of the new type party of the proletariat, in addition to being probably still the most forceful anti-opportunistic plea in favor of the preeminence of revolutionary theory when designing the politics and institutions of the proletariat. So, as we see, theory, consciousness and also totality appear forming in their very historical origins the ferment of universality on which the Communist Party is based, classically and necessarily. Along with this, we could highlight other features of this totalizing character that defines the proletariat and makes it a unique oppressed class in history. It is now enough, by way of illustration, to point out that in the case of the proletariat, unlike, for example, the feudal peasantry, its production and exploitation, its necessary work and the extra work that is sucked into it, they appear forming an indistinguishable total unit. But in addition, the proletariat informs us of another classic feature associated with universality, which is none other than that of depth, that of radicality, in the semantic sense of the term. That is, in the uprooting in an ultimate substrate, and that of being located at the root of a conglomerate or problem. And here it is not only that, in a positive immediate sense, the entire capitalist social regime rests on that totality of conditions of existence that our class represents, but also that, referring to that first universalist attribute of subjectivity, with the proletariat, culminates the progressive historical immersion of the conscious intellectual center of gravity of society towards its practical productive root. In fact, the bourgeoisie is, unlike its slave or feudal predecessors, the first historical ruling class where the attribute of intellectual direction of society appears organically linked to the productive process. But there's still something below it. Precisely, and not by chance, its exploited counterpart, the proletariat, will be, in turn, the first oppressed class in history that generates an entire conception of the world that is not only self-awareness as a reproduction of its subordination. This historical material process would be consubstantially identical to the process that the second part of the new orientation, consciousness and revolution, delineates from a theoretical philosophical plane of progressive historical approach and fusion of social consciousness and movement from subjective criticism to revolutionary praxis. In this way, marked by those attributes of universality that we have outlined, characterized by the rise of consciousness, its closure as a totality from the organic interiority of its proletarian center of gravity and the descent to depth, is how social matter historically leads to the era of the communist revolution. However, various historically necessary factors will prevent these elements from being articulated in a consciously coherent way during the first great historical attempt of this revolution, the October cycle, including here the period of its preparation. In this sense, it may be that the most symptomatic expression of this inevitable elude is the very retreat, in his effective political activity, of Marx himself, from the concept of revolutionary praxis formulated by him, and here it could be appropriate to add to that formulation his active involvement in the revolutionary shock of 1848, towards that of revolutionary criticism as a nuclear work, fundamental and with greater historical projection of his political career. In this regard, and without abounding in it, we will be content to underline, linking with that attribute of the developed subjectivity in which we have stopped briefly, the fundamental element of directionality purpose that nourishes this type of criticism, and that is, precisely, the one that configures it as the necessary prelude to, and orients it towards, the revolutionary practice. 13. Among those historically necessary factors that will determine the limitations of the October cycle, probably one of the most fundamental, if not the one that most, will be that historical intertwining of the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions, on which we have already abounded on other occasions since the LR, and whose expression manifests is constituted by that revolutionary year of 1848 to which we have already referred when talking about Marx's activity, historical detail, that of the involvement of the Rhenish in such events, by the way, which most likely does not lack, far from the point of view of the cycle perspective. Having been subjectivity, and especially its conscious expression, the axis that has allowed us to start this brief tour of some of the fundamental traits of universality, in its relationship with the revolutionary proletariat and Marxism as its last and most consequent carrier in the history of the class struggle, it seems appropriate that it is also now the most convenient prism to outline some traits of those limitations of the October cycle and its relationship with the qualitatively highest starting point from which the historical process objectively allows us to face a new cycle of the World Proletarian Revolution, RPM. With this we link directly to the key role that the unclassified bourgeois intellectual played in the preparation and direction of the first cycle of the RPM. The one that the Communist Manifesto already characterized. Nowadays a sector of the bourgeoisie is passed to the proletariat, particularly that sector of bourgeois ideologues that have theoretically risen to the understanding of the whole of the historical movement. This sociological characterization of what will be the composition of the bulk of the theoretical vanguard of the proletariat during the October cycle and its surroundings places us, as we say, in an ideal perspective to point out some of its key historical limits. In this way, in the historical base of the revolutionary wave of October we fundamentally have the fusion of an avant-garde, as characterized by being the bearer of a certain form, historically necessary, of scientific socialism and composed in its bulk by that type of radical bourgeois intellectual declassified, with masses of the class that, in turn, come in the same immediacy, when they are not yet immersed in such a process, of the period of historical accumulation of class forces, nucleated around their immediate demands as an economic class and presided over by their consciousness itself as to such. Beyond the evident generating weight of the bourgeois element, an ineluctable toll to the immaturity of the proletariat as a revolutionary class and the objective and equally unbeatable by the historical and political in large part, neighborhood of the bourgeois revolution in the subjective, what we are interested in highlighting now, although this is intimately linked to the above, is that what is in the historical base of October is the external fusion of particular elements already given and configured largely independently of each other. This, as the LR has already indicated extensively at other times, determined that the relationship of the proletariat with the revolutionary theory was presided over by a deficit in terms of its assimilation and socialization by the masses of the class. In short, the relationship of the proletariat with Marxism during the October cycle will rather be presided over by superficiality. And this in a double sense. Superficial as to this aforementioned assimilation, and superficial as to the fact that the center of gravity of the revolutionary consciousness of the proletariat is not in its deep social substrate, but in those déclassate elements coming from the social antagonist. All this determined a paradigm, an a prioristic way of understanding the revolution in accordance with the degree of development of science and the experience of the class struggle of that time, dominated by spontaneity, while the key to it was the game and impulse between elements already given in themselves, already configured independently and in a considerable stage of development in its autonomous particularity. And this is something, by the way, that it is even possible that it was reflected in the formation of the first proletarian party of a new effective type in history, Bolshevism. It is, as we say, and even at the risk of being repetitive, historically necessary limits. We emphasize it because it is something that will never be stressed enough, precisely because it is one of the main boundaries that distinguish a dialectical understanding of Marxism with respect to its positivist denaturing. It is not a question of amending the plan to October or the historical feat that the proletarian revolutions of the 20th century suppose, but the limitations, these indicated and others, are only shown as such from the current perspective, with the curtain of the first cycle closed, and were indistinguishable then. And this, simply, because they were not such limitations at that time, but they were consistent with the degree of material and social development of the moment. The degree that the revolution itself contributed decisively to alter, transforming, and what better proof can there be of the degree of depth and scope of the proletarian revolution than the fact that it revolutionizes itself, that it is able to go successively leaving many of its forms obsolete while creating new ones? Precisely, the perspective that we are only now in an objective disposition to adopt is a conquest of, and only of, the struggle of past generations of communists. As they say, indeed, we are only because they were. It was those efforts that drove historical development and those that have endowed us with the most valuable, the revolutionary experience. An experience that is the irreplaceable and fundamental pillar to restart the RPM from a greater degree of maturity, from a greater degree of coherence with respect to the objective stage of development reached by matter. As we said, the prism chosen here to probe the limits of the October cycle allows us to link with a shallow look at the bases of the second cycle of the RPM, as they can be glimpsed on the horizon today. As the first part of the new orientation, balance and rectification points out, if something characterizes the current period of interregnum between two cycles of the RPM, from the point of view of the vanguard of the proletariat, it is the historical desertion of that declassified bourgeois intellectual who played such a fundamental role in the past. And this desertion does not refer so much to a political subjective, volitional act of that intellectual, motivated by the impression of the defeat, still recent, of the proletariat in its first emancipatory attempt, but that it is a fact of historical objective scale. Indeed, the development of social matter in the degree reached so far requires that the intellectual carriers of social progress come immediately from the class that condenses the depth and totality, its universality, of that material development. That is, historical development requires an immediate origin of those ideological depositories from the perspective of progress from the bowels of the class that treasures its potential, the proletariat. And, likewise, it requires that its form, the morphology of the embodiment of that intellectual function in social progress, also adopt the most congruent characteristics with respect to those that historical development has given to that generative base, that is, an appropriate form with those universalist traits that define the proletariat and that we have outlined. They demand, therefore, and in the first place, that their form be immediately and consciously collectively a true social intellectual. In this way, indeed, as the new orientation points out, those elements of bourgeois origin are not that they do not want, it is that they can no longer adopt the position of the ideological vanguard. Thus, the current ideological avant-garde of the proletariat, committed to laying the conscious foundations for a whole new historical cycle of the RPM, what we call Marxist-Leninist theoretical avant-garde, and unlike the one that starred in the preparation of the October cycle, is, with respect to the bulk of its sociological composition, formed, if we are allowed a certain reductionism, legitimate by attending to the forge in which in the first instance its members must be polished, the revolutionary theory, so we can call it workers. With this expression, labor theorists, we are first of all designating a whole historical novelty. Indeed, it is not that the preparation of the October cycle lacked conspicuous workers' figures of ideological stature, such as, for example, and for adhering to the genuinely Marxist tradition, a Dietz-Jen or a Bebel, but the point is that the center of gravity of the ideological avant-garde of the time did not revolve around them, but that they were located, from the point of view of their social mass, on their periphery, acting more as an exception, as heralds of the new, than as guiding protagonists of their activity. Only today, precisely due to the development propitiated by the first onslaught of the RPM and its conclusion, these labor theorists are in a position to constitute an authentic social layer, an axis of construction of the avant-garde and hegemonic in the process of directing the RPM. Precisely, their formation, as a consciously articulated plan, with final intention, constitutes the immediate social material manifestation of what the LR call the ideological reconstitution of communism. A manifestation that is none other than that construction of communist cadres of which the new orientation speaks. But, secondly, when talking about workers' theorists we are, consciously, appealing to a contradiction that is, nothing less, the one that articulates the whole of class civilization, not only its last capitalist manifestation the social division between intellectual work and manual work. With the requirement to form such a layer of labor theorists, with the requirement that the modern class tied to manual work is able to highlight from itself a sector of ideologues theoretically elevated to the understanding of the whole of the historical movement. To paraphrase the manifesto, we are placing with all intent precisely a dagger in the heart of that entire classist civilization, demonstrating congruently, not only the historical depth of the proletarian revolution, but also the consistency of its projection in that sense, its capacity and will to erect a new world emerging from the deepest root of social matter as well as articulated as a class society. All this implies, again consciously, a process of derevolutionization within the class called to revolutionize the whole of society. This, and not anything else, is the preparation of the revolution, reconstitution of its governing subject since the creation of an objective revolutionary social relationship, the Communist Party, capable, once established, of extending concentrically to cover the entire totality of social matter. With this, the totality, as a universalist category, not only adapts to its historical class base, to that condensation of conditions of existence that is in itself the proletariat, but it is the form that the very revolutionary course of our class, its movement for itself adopts, the revolutionary process as an integral and integrated totality, where there is no longer place for the Oedipist fragmentation of revisionist empiricism, but it is the same revolutionary process from the beginning to the end, developing and expanding through successive qualitative leaps, of which, for example, the conquest of power, once sublimated as a peak moment of the revolution, it is only one of them, and secondary, at least in the order of succession, with respect to what the constitution of the Communist Party represents as a large-scale, effective operational formation of the revolutionary subject. This totality, by which the class endows itself from within itself with its revolutionary consciousness and perspective at the same time that it materially projects them, allows us to return again to the universalist trait of depth. And it is that the self-formation of the proletariat as a revolutionary subject, the situation of the founding and articulating axis of this whole process in its very bowels, implies, from the historical material point of view, the definitive and full landing of the center of intellectual gravity of social progress on the last practical productive substrate in which the last mode of class production is sustained. Of course, these universalist notions of totality depth that we are outlining as they nourish the current revolutionary policy of the proletariat, that of its reconstitution as such a revolutionary subject, do not contravene the authentic touchstone that distinguishes Marxist revolutionary politics. that the revolutionary consciousness must be introduced from outside the spontaneous movement of the working class. On the contrary, this understanding of the need to highlight a social layer of labor theorists makes this process more coherently profound, more universal. We will not extend here in it. It is enough to say that the LR, in the face of the old and simple fusion of external elements given that characterized the constitution of the revolutionary subject during the October cycle, poses a process of scission-fusion-scission, which, from the point of view of dialectics, is nothing but the expression of a movement of denial that, as we have also pointed out on other occasions, is precisely for this conception nothing more than the rational structure of the subject. With this, the process of its reconstitution, although, in all probability, more prolonged, will also have as a culmination a more vigorous and radical, that is, well-rooted, complexion and articulation, giving greater guarantees on the projection and success of your company. In short and recapitulating, the development of matter and, within it, the historical development of society reach such a degree of condensation that they will promote a process of such a long-reaching scope as the RPM in its first cycle. However, the necessary stage of immaturity of this revolution in its dawn makes this historical densification, this explosion of universality, which it represents, is inevitably expressed at that first moment, and this is perfectly consistent with the dialectical laws of development of matter in its most elementary form, still dominated by those contrastively indicated characteristics: exteriority, particularity, superficiality, spontaneity. It is the first expression of that universal subject, although congruent with his own historical immaturity. However, precisely the historical impulse that the October cycle has propitiated leaves the elements arranged on the stage so that they can now be conjugated with a higher consistency and articulation, so that now the RPM process itself gives a twist in that universalist condensation, interiority, totality, depth, consciousness. In short, fullness and maturity of the subject. The proletariat is today historically mature as a revolutionary class. Today it is much more aware of the principles and purposes of its company. Precisely, that fin informs us that communism will be, among other things, full socialization and, therefore, the full individualization of the human being, the integral development of the potentialities of each one. Consequently, the social bond will no longer be, as at present, that external objectification that appears as an imposition, but will be internal, the free will to maintain that bond based on the full self-awareness of each individual. If equality is the brick of communism, freedom will be its cement and mortar. In this way, crowning this journey, we find another great feature associated with universality in that aforementioned tradition of thought, freedom. In this sense, and in parallel, this end of freedom demands a correlative principle, which is none other than that constitutive denial of the avant-garde, that act of free will consisting of facing the determinations that our proletarian social position immediately imposes on us and starting the path of discipline and constancy, of consciousness, of being the seed, vanguard, of the only purpose for which it is worth giving everything. What results is, graphically, the drawing of a series of concentric circles in which, first, matter in general, second, social matter in particular, and, third, the RPM itself close in an increasingly dense beam of universality, overflowing as an objective possibility of power, finally, to propose history as a conscious activity of free construction of humanity. History, knocks on our doors today. If, in that act of free will, you decide to open them, you will probably hear a single sentence from her lips: now, at last, you have a world to win. Committee for Reconstruction, December 2016.